Welcome to For the Church, a podcast for the flock of Zion Presbyterian Church in Columbia, Tennessee. We want to help you think biblically about everyday matters. Zion Church exists to join Jesus and his mission to reach people with the gospel and then equip his people to worship and to serve. I'm your host, Keaton.Paul, and joining me is my regular conversation partner and co-host, Seth Scruggs. So this season, it's the summer, so we are watching movies. And today, we actually are going to talk about two movies in the span of one episode. Two actually pretty long movies with a third one on the way. But before we dive right in, hey Seth, how are you?
I'm so good.
Yes.
I am coming off of the high of watching these movies, and I liked them a lot. So yeah. I'm excited. I know that you've seen them and we talked about them a little bit, but I don't think we actually talked about what you thought about them at all. So I'm pretty excited to start to dig in.
Yeah.
To this.
Do we want to start there with like just first impressions?
Yeah. I'll give a synopsis. So because we haven't said what we're talking about yet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's right.
We are starting with Dune parts 1 and 2. So just a quick synopsis from our friends at ChatGPT. Dune is a science fiction epic in which all of the noble houses of a futuristic empire are vying for control of the planet Arrakis, also called Dune, a planet that holds the coveted substance spice that's the primary engine for the economy of the empire. It centers on Paul Atreides, a member of one of the noble houses whose family assumes control of the planet, and he also has some mysterious supernatural powers. After his family is betrayed by the Emperor, he is forced to go on the run and find the protection of the natives of the planet, called the Fremen, who think that he might be a promised Messiah figure. So essentially the story follows Paul. Part 1 kind of follows Paul Atreides as he is betrayed and has to go out into the desert. And then part 2 kind of picks up immediately where part 1 ends, kind of follows him as he starts to fulfill this narrative that the natives of the planet kind of have. Yeah. And really what it centers on is him wrestling with whether or not he is going to willingly fulfill this kind of messianic and I'm using that's the word they use, but it's also a very particular word. Yeah. Because of what the story is kind of doing. It's also these two movies are based on one book. That's kind of why I wanted to put them together, because they really are one story. It's just so long, kind of like a Lord of the Rings situation where it really is just one story, but it's so long it's kind of broken up over a couple of things. And so it's this film. The first one came out in 2021. The second one came out this year, 2024. It's supposed to come out last fall, but due to the strikes and things, it got moved. It's directed by a guy named Denis Villeneuve, who's a French-Canadian filmmaker. He made Sicario with Emily Blunt. He made Rival, Blade Runner 2049. So he's made some big films since kind of making...
Definite vibe, too.
Definite vibe, which I think we'll be talking about. He's not the filmmaker that you would think of for a massive blockbuster, in the sense of like a lot of his films are very quiet, very slow moving, very thoughtful, which I think that this movie certainly has. These movies certainly have in spades, but we'll jump into that in a little bit. Tell me, what did you think of it? Did you like it? What did you like? What did you not like?
Yeah. So full transparent. Like from the get-go, like we just need to be aware that I'm a very casual movie watcher. Okay. So as I watch a movie, more often than not, I'm also reading on my Kindle at the same time, which is a very, like, it's kind of a dad thing to do. I've talked with students before, your dad puts on like whatever ESPN or his news station of choice, but at the same time like he's on Craigslist looking at trucks or Facebook Marketplace. He's not going to buy anything. He doesn't need a new truck. He's just derping. But if you touch that remote and try to change the channel, he's like, "Well, I was watching that." And so I don't know like what kind of weird thing happens where guys enter into what I call the dad land, and you just live in your own little world, but that's kind of happened. So there's that caveat. Okay, I had for especially the first one, I had to take 2 swipes at it. The first the first go round, and my poor wife, she has to get so annoyed with me watching movies and stuff. We put it on and I'm like, yeah, we're going to watch Dune because we're going to talk about it on the podcast. And this was like, I don't know, this was probably like February. So it was it was a good while ago. So we put it on. It was free at the time on some sort of streaming service. I don't remember which one, but so we're sitting here watching it. I'm obviously derping, like big time derping. And, every now and then I kept having to, I felt so old, but every now and then I'd have to, wait, what just happened? And like, I don't know what's, the audio, maybe this is a critique, maybe it's on purpose. I don't know what it is, but the audio is so quiet. Mm-hmm. It's super. And so we're like, we probably looked like we were like 80 years old because we're like, I can't hear anything. We got to turn the captions on. I can't hear what's wrong with, like, who could hear that sort of thing? And then the music would come like blaring in, and Eddie's trying to sleep, and we're like, well, the dang music is too loud. Like, we're so old. I might as well have been sitting there quilting or something. I don't know, but like,
my wife was crocheting for a lot of it.
Okay,
so we're kind of in the same boat.
And I can't hear a thing. So we probably got like 30 minutes in, and we just kept going. And after a while, I just look at Destiny and I'm like, babe, I'm just not into this. Can we put on a Hallmark or something? I couldn't get through it. And again, I have no right to give any sort of acting critiques whatsoever. This is purely like, I've probably said it from the pulpit. I'll say it here. I fully recognize that I'm uncultured swine, and I am fine with that, right? It's okay, that we're, yeah. So anyway, I'm just not a huge Timothy Chalamet. I've been told I pronounce it wrong. I'm just not like a huge that guy fan. He was in that one Woody Allen movie, and I was like, awkward but good. Like that was pretty decent. And then he was in Lady Bird, and I was like, he did great. Good job, bud. But he, I just feel like he kind of plays the same guy. So anyway, that's sort of my hot take. I am well aware that I am probably exceedingly wrong about that, and that's fine. It is what it is. But aside from that, it took 2 tries to get through the first one. The second time through, I kind of had I was in the right point of reference. I had the right frame of mind, and we watched it, and I was like, okay, I like this. This is good. It's kind of a slow burn, but once you get in it, you're in it.
Yeah.
And then we watched the second one the next night, and the same sort of thing of like, okay, got it. This is much better the second time around. Now that I've got my expectations, this is not like a Bourne movie where everything is, basically a rocket, and the camera angles are like rockets. Like everything is just, it's always going. This is definitely a slow burn. It takes a minute to get into. So yes, first time I was not thoroughly impressed. Second time it was better, much better. And I would say now it's a good movie. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, so the first time that I saw both films, I was in a theater.
Okay. Yeah.
Both of them very large format. The first was IMAX. The second wasn't IMAX, but it was big, bigger than like your standard movie theater. And for me, in both of those experiences, because they became such an overwhelming kind of experience, I was just, you're totally enveloped when you're in that environment. Like when you're watching something on a screen 50, 60, 70 feet tall, like it's just, you're so enveloped in that, in all of the sound and all of that. And in a room that is tuned for that sound, which is a big deal to what you were saying. Yeah. I definitely noticed being at home, it was very different. And like I have a decent sound bar kind of system at home, but it was not, there were still points where it got really quiet. And I do think, that's on purpose for what Denis Villeneuve is trying to do. And what I think the movie is really successful at, which is this feeling of creating a world that feels very real and very lived in and very tactile. Yeah. Where, it doesn't really feel like, it doesn't feel fake. There's no point in it that feels like this intangible kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you watch science fiction movies and it's so CGI'd. Yeah. I think of like the Marvel movies that kind of feel like cartoons at some point. And that doesn't feel the same way. Yeah. Dune does not feel the same way as those movies. And that's due to a number of techniques that they used and certain things. But it really, to me, watching it, and I think having had that experience and then watching it at home, I was kind of able to slip back into that mindset a little bit. Yeah. Where it was like, this is the world. And I think that once you kind of hand yourself over to that, and because it feels so lived in, and this is something, like I said, Villeneuve does really, really well. Mm-hmm. If you've seen Arrival or Blade Runner 2049, especially, this is other kind of science fiction films. Both of those movies feel very lived in and have a definite tone and a definite pace that I think makes it much easier to kind of slip into and to say, okay, once you kind of get in phase with the world, you're kind of in it. Yeah. And it's to me, it was very, very successful. I think one of the big things is, if you've read Dune, which I have, it is frankly almost incomprehensible. Like it is one of the clunkiest. Oh yes. Just so deep in the weeds kind of world building. Yeah. There's a glossary at the back, and like if you don't read the glossary, like you're lost. Like there's just it's almost impossible to really keep track with. But something that I think is so successful about the film is that he does a really good job at, he and his co-writers do a really good job at slimming down the narrative. And even though it still is very complex, and there's a lot of like moving pieces, it's a lot of like palace intrigue kind of things. But what he does a really good job at is kind of slimming down to, okay, what are the core ideas that I want to get at? What are the core themes? What is kind of happening? Yeah. And then kind of basically taking away anything that doesn't get at those themes, and then really slimming down and kind of going to those, which is really funny to call this like a slimmed down version. That's right, of the book, because it is very complex, and it is 2.5 hour movies. Yeah. But it is, in a way, like it doesn't, yes, it's slow moving, but it never stalls. Like it never isn't moving at some point. Like there's always kind of something happening that's kind of grabbing you and keeping you going in the story. There's no point. I didn't have a point where I was like kind of bored, like or like, I wish this would pick up. Yeah. Like it everything kind of feels like, okay, this is logically progressing and moving and moving and moving and moving. And even if there are things I don't necessarily understand yet, like it's raising questions and leaving questions unanswered and like trying to get you to stay interested. That's obviously happening. but there's no point where it was like, no, not into this.
Yeah.
And especially coming at it now, coming back to Dune Part 1, having seen Part 2,
Yeah.
and seeing kind of what he does with the character in the end, I was really blown away with how everything kind of comes to a logical conclusion.
Yeah.
In Part 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm with you on the Timothée Chalamet piece.
Okay. I don't want to be a jerk because, like, I know, and he has things that he's great in that I really like, but especially for that one, and then like the Little Women that he was in, I'm like, it's too much Chad, He's just kind of like walking around, but he's also like he's trying to be a serious Chad. What I mean by Chad is he's the guy that's just always like, okay. Right,
kind of bro.
Yeah, very bro. But but that's like his. It's kind of like the Nicolas Cage phenomenon of he plays himself. But he in those two, to a degree, ever so slight. He felt like he was still broing, chatting. How? This is people won't understand that. But he's just doing that, but also trying to be serious.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting there and I'm just like. You're too okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I don't mean okay. I mean more like okay, right?
Yeah. I think the final 20 to 30 minutes of Dune Part 2, I think it might be the best performance that he's given.
Yeah.
So we're gonna spoil the film. But essentially, what happens? So Paul is on this journey.
Yeah.
He is having to go through the desert with the native people. He's trying to take back his planet, get revenge on this family that has betrayed him.
Yeah.
But part of what's going on is that he's realizing that it's bigger than him, right? The empire itself is kind of against his family.
Yeah.
And he's learning about his place in this kind of messianic prophecy.
Yeah.
Right. And what he learns is two things.
Yeah.
Number one is that the prophecy really doesn't exist. Right. Like, or it does, in that these people, this native people, have been told that it exists, that they should be looking for someone who will fulfill all of these signs and these kinds of things. Yeah. But then what he discovers is that really this secret group, again, is, like I said, it's very complex, but this secret group has kind of planted this. And now he has essentially the choice to either take advantage of it and take advantage of the people around him, or to let that go and to essentially do the right thing and let it go. And ultimately, he decides to take advantage of that, take the power, and then to essentially use that power to get revenge on all of his enemies. And I think what's so that last 20 minutes where he really makes that shift from, I don't know what I'm going to do, and then you're kind of realizing what he's going to do. I think it's some of the best performance. Maybe his best performance ever.
That's right.
And I think that actually dovetails really nicely with kind of talking about some of the core themes of the film.
Absolutely.
Because really at the core of the film, it's about power, right?
Yeah.
Like that's kind of what everyone wants. Everyone is kind of vying for control of this planet and vying for control of each other. And it's a lot of palace intrigue around who has power, who doesn't have power.
Oh, yeah.
Paul has this supernatural power. What does that mean? And all of these things kind of fighting. And then really what that does to people.
Yeah. There was a sense in which this could get me in trouble. It was like wonderfully Nietzschean.
Yeah.
Like it, and again, like, I'm not an existential nihilist, so don't like freak out. But it wasn't so much that I didn't pick up a nihilistic theme in it, but it was definitely in Nietzsche's view of the Übermensch, the Superman, the rise to power, right? If there's no like real meaning, and meaning is just kind of what you make of it, then just become the most powerful version of yourself that you can be and have all the power, and then you can create the meaning. And so there's not totally that, but there's definitely something there of a little bit more of the unconventional. It's not like a lot of the superhero stories that we hear of like wielding power for good, which is like kind of a Robin Hood type thing. It was not that at all.
There's a very negative view of what it means to have power in this.
Definitely, which is kind of refreshing in a sense.
Yep.
I like when people change up stories like that and are just kind of like honest about where they are. In a story they're trying to depict some sort of theme of reality, at least through their lens. And so,
and it's so intentionally subverting our expectations, because by the time that Paul makes this turn, and this is really where I think we're going to camp out in our discussion, it's like all of this kind of leads to this one crucial decision point.
That's right.
Which is, by the way, just good filmmaking. Is that everything leads to a crucial decision point, and you're hanging on with your protagonist, and then he makes the decision that you don't expect. That's right. Even I went when I saw part 2 in a theater with some friends, and we left discussing it, and I was wowed in the sense of what you're talking about, where I'm like,
that's right.
It hit on something so inherently human. That absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
That's right.
It's an idiom and a cliche for a reason. And that's exactly what the movie hit on.
That's right.
Is that Paul ultimately is not a hero.
Right.
Ultimately he's given this decision, and he makes a decision to take advantage, to abuse his power and abuse the people around him. And but as I was walking out, everyone around me was like, "Oh, but maybe he's doing it for a reason. Like maybe it'll turn out good in the end."
Right.
Or maybe and they're trying to essentially justify away.
That's right.
This character because they found him so compelling.
And there's like this for the casual movie watcher. Again, spoiler, terribly sorry. The love of Paul's life, at least so it is Zendaya. I can't remember her name.
Character is Chani.
Chani, yes. Okay. So at the climactic moment, he basically has to be like, "Can I be with the love of my life?" And we can just live together and take have a nice simple life. It seems kind of, and everything will just kind of dissipate, and now that we can bring peace and it'll be fine, we can just go live our lives. But it's like instead he leaves Zendaya to go marry this other princess type thing and marry into this royal family so he can kind of take over everything. To the casual movie watcher though, which is precisely where I was, very casually watching, I was like, "Oh, what? You can't do that." But then I was like, "Oh wait, I know what's going to happen." Right? Because this is a big, this is just one big love story. We're going to come back around. We're going to come back. I see what you're doing. There was the twist. Here's my Hallmark movie. We're good. He's going to come back around and they're going to live happily ever after. Right? And maybe not. Yeah. So anyway, but it's more about power than about love.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, and you're right, because ultimately that decision is him choosing. So he has this relationship with Johnny. It's a very real love, right? It's a very real relationship. And ultimately what he does is he chooses power. He chooses marrying the emperor's daughter so that he can become emperor. Instead of choosing Johnny and his and this kind of real love in this real life. I think that it is, it's an incredible choice. It's an incredibly bold choice, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
And I wondered, because that is more or less what happens in the book. They changed some things, but generally, and it's like, yeah, the book has a very negative view of power. The movie has a very negative view of what power does to us. And ultimately it's a picture of what, when we are in control of our fate, what we do. And it's right. I think it's a great mirror to human nature.
Yeah. So on that note, because that like linked in with his kind of the power motif, as it were, there's also this messianic, and they use the word Messiah. So like
it's very purposeful.
Very on the up front about it. So like, what's happening there?
So I think there's several things happening. The first would be like there's a definite kind of critique of religion happening, and I think that especially if you're a Christian and you're watching this movie, you're probably you're going to bristle at some of that, right? Like you're going to bristle at the use of the word Messiah, although it's 100% not being used in the same way that we as Christians would use the word Messiah. It's still it is very intentionally co-opting that word because of the meaning that it carries for people like us. People who do believe in a Messiah that has come. It's co-opting that word very particularly. And so he's caught up in this thing, and the movie has a kind of negative view of religion, right? Like the people who believe in this Messiah figure are kind of laughed at and looked down upon.
They're called fundamentalists.
And they're looked down on, like, and they're told like, and kind of the image of Chani is this kind of progressive, younger person who says, I don't believe in these prophecies. I don't believe in these myths. I don't believe that this is what's happening. And she accepts Paul not because of what he might be, this Messiah figure, but because of who he is. And that's, again, why it's so shocking, that turn. Because you've seen her kind of accept him for who he is. And also because, and Zendaya plays it so wonderfully.
She
and
does.
Portrays that, the betrayal again at the end. So wonderfully. But it definitely has a negative view of this kind of religious undertones, and a negative view of what Paul does, which is essentially become the Messiah that they want. And so when you talk about, so we'll just make the comparison to Jesus, and I wanted to bring in scripture here. But like there's obvious comparisons to Jesus, right? Like that's kind of what he's trying to do. As the writers are doing, the filmmakers are doing.
Not what Jesus is doing.
Not what Jesus is doing. But so the writers are kind of drawing this contrast. I would say contrast. And because ultimately Paul becomes the Messiah that they want. But who's the Messiah that we have, right? And so Paul gives them what they want. They want a holy war. He's going to give them a holy war. They want to tear down the systems. They want to tear it down physically. Then that's what he's going to give them. But then we compare that to Jesus, and I could go to 1,000 different verses here. But I'll go to Philippians 2, verse 5 is where we'll start. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man, being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And it goes on to really just kind of describe who Jesus is, right? The difference. So a lot of stories that build on this messianic myth will pattern their heroes a little more closely to Jesus. In that they will become some sort of a martyr who will go through some sort of not necessarily death, but like you take Harry Potter, right?
Yeah.
If you've seen or read Harry Potter, I'm just spoiling everything. In the 7th book, there's this moment where Harry has kind of been on this inevitable path.
Right.
and he has to accept being killed.
Yeah.
And then ultimately comes back.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it kills the part of the villain who is in him, and
there's a whole
other mythology there.
Yeah.
But again, like Harry as this kind of, sympathetic, more or less innocent figure, following this path that ultimately leads to death, that then brings him back.
Yeah.
And there are dozens of other characters like that, hundreds of other characters.
Yeah.
We talked last week about the Joseph Campbell kind of structure, this hero with 1,000 faces, this kind of pattern.
Yeah.
So many of them are built around this life that is lived in innocence that ultimately leads to some sort of a death that leads to a resurrection of sorts.
Yeah.
And because one might argue, if you're a Christian, that's the story that we're all searching for ultimately.
Right. That's right.
And the story that we all need.
Yeah.
But what Frank Herbert in the original story and then Denis Villeneuve and his co-writers do here is they kind of turn it on its head.
Yeah.
And they do what in the Bible the original disciples wanted Jesus to do. You think about the image of choosing Barabbas over Jesus.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Why did they choose Barabbas? Well, he was a zealot. He was an insurrectionist. He was what they wanted.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And essentially what Paul does is ultimately Paul Atreides, not
Paul,
the Apostle Paul, who wrote the book of Philippians. What Paul in Dune does is he becomes Barabbas.
That's right.
He becomes what the people want. And you end up with this kind of moment at the end of part 2 where everyone surges.
Yeah.
And they start this war.
Yeah.
Because he's given them permission. He has taken over.
Dang.
And it's a very negative view of what happens. And I think it's very much tapped into human nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And that would be, that is the title to a great book that somebody needs to write, Becoming Barabbas. Dang. Like the rise of political extremism.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is like, why this movie now? Like, why was it,
Yeah, so that's something we talked about last week is like, why?
Yeah.
Why now? Why is this movie successful now? And part of it is, you look at the movie landscape with where we are. Things that do well are big budget, science fiction, fantasy, franchise movies that we can sell more than one of.
Right.
Timothy Chalamet and Zendaya are big movie stars. Like there are a lot of logical reasons.
Yeah.
What isn't the logical reason is a movie that takes on power.
Yeah.
Like when you describe Dune.
Yeah.
Most people will talk about the world building, the character, maybe, but really the world. The world is amazing. We finally have the technology to really pull off the kind of vision of the future and these planets all of these kinds of things, which is true.
Riding big worms.
Because we've kind of skated over it. There are really beautiful and amazing sequences in this movie. And this, if you don't know, this movie was attempted to be made in the 1980s, kind of building off of the Star Wars craze.
Okay.
And it is much maligned for many reasons.
Yeah, fair.
But one of those is that essentially they kind of came to this realization of the technology just isn't here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think also the structure of we can build out 2 or 3 movies.
Yeah.
And tell this one book and that kind of thing just wasn't there either.
Yeah.
But so that answers one, why now? I think audiences are kind of a little bit more prepared for science fiction, otherworldly, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The other why now is in our current moment, in our current cultural, political moment, which I think are very, very linked.
Mm-hmm.
We are constantly telling these Messiah-like stories.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Totally.
So every political cycle, and we're in one right now, in 2024, every election year, it's this person, no matter which side you're on, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, it's always this person is the one who's going to finally save our country.
Yeah.
That person wants to kill it. I'm going to save it.
Yeah.
No matter what side you're on.
That's right.
And And every election since I have been of voting age, which is not admittedly too long.
Yeah.
But even since before I was of voting age, but like was kind of paying attention to the national landscape. So roughly like 10 or so years. And I'm sure this is the same for you.
Yeah.
Every election I can remember in my lifetime, really.
Yeah.
This is the most important election of our lifetime. This is the most important
big one.
This is the big one. Every time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every time.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly seeing these leaders grasping at power and failing.
Yeah.
And watching them as the power corrupts.
Yeah.
The big thing that everyone always talks about is that these leaders make promises, they get into office and they don't fulfill them.
Yeah.
And why?
Yeah.
I know, a big thing is like, we're like, oh, well, you have to get into office and then start campaigning again so that you can keep your funds and so you can keep your office.
Yeah.
And frankly, the church is not exempt from this. As we're recording this, several stories have broken in the last few weeks, and even more so in the last, 5-10 years.
Oh man,
of church leaders who get into positions of power.
Yeah.
Who then start to abuse that power,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And especially in this age where we can like all find out everything.
That's right.
All the time.
Yeah.
It's not hard.
Right.
It's very difficult to keep those things hidden.
Yeah.
But you look at something like the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, which I think is an excellent example of storytelling and also just an excellent example of taking that in a way that is very God honoring. So I would highly recommend that if you haven't.
Yeah.
But when these church leaders, and not just church leaders, but connecting that to where we are right now, when certain church leaders get into positions of power,
mm-hmm.
they begin to accept this myth about themselves.
Oh, totally.
And
totally.
To call it a Messiah myth may be wrong, but in the sense of, I am the one.
Oh yeah.
I am the only one who can do this. I am the only one who can do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
And that always will fail.
Yeah.
It will always end in abusing other people.
That's right.
And so that's what we see in this movie. And I think that what connects with people is whether they're in the church or not, they're seeing these stories, whether they're active in politics or not, they obviously are seeing all of these stories.
Yeah.
And when you're watching these institutions, the human parts of these institutions crumble.
Yeah.
And then you see that again reflected back to you on screen.
Right.
In a way that actually gives you empathy with the character, right? Because again, as I was walking out of the theater with these friends, and they're trying to explain, like, actually, no, Paul's got to be doing it for a good reason.
Yeah.
Paul's got to be doing it. Actually gave me a little bit of insight into, because you read these stories, you hear about these things, and you hear about leaders falling, whether political or religious, and you're thinking, how? Yeah. How did no one stop them earlier than they did? Yeah. It's like the common question, but I think this movie, in a sense, kind of answers that.
Oh yeah, totally.
In that we only spend 4 hours with Paul before he kind of flips us on our head, and we're shocked.
Yeah.
Imagine spending 10 years in the trenches with someone.
That's right.
Building something that you really truly believe in, then watching that just be swept out from under you.
Oh yeah.
As power takes over.
And it's a pretty compelling case too of when when it's framed, hey, look at how much good it's doing, the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, the Rise and Fall of Hillsong, like there are 100,000 people every single week who are hearing the gospel because of this empire that this guy has built. We got to keep this going. And there's this, do you want 100,000 people to hear the gospel or not? Because if this guy doesn't exist, then they don't. And you're like, well, shoot.
Yeah, I got to do it.
Okay.
Well, and to connect that back to the movie, that's what Paul is offering, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to let these people take back over their planet. They've been oppressed for so long.
That's right.
I am going to let them take back their planet
That's
and
right.
turn it into this oasis.
That's right. And there's a sense of like, well, then, like, by any means, like,
do it.
Yeah. The ends will justify the means. If freedom is the end, then, buddy, get inside and do what you got to do. Right. That's the way it feels. And that's, ultimately, that's bad ethics, but it can be argued pretty compellingly.
Yeah. And I think that, our call as Christians then is to essentially just not give into that narrative, right? Like,
yeah,
politically or in a church setting,
absolutely,
we cannot give into this narrative that says, I am the only one, I am the chosen one.
Yeah,
which I don't think most people aren't going to say I am the chosen one, but there are certain people where that will be very clearly the attitude.
That's right.
Of like, I am the one.
Yeah,
I'm the one who can do it.
And I mean, it is super easy for especially pastors to get a Messiah complex.
Absolutely, yeah. Because there is a sense in which they are, hopefully, if they're mostly being faithful, like facilitating the salvation of souls.
That's right. That's right.
Not doing the actual saving.
Yeah.
But there is a sense in which they are facilitating that to happen.
Yeah, and so, that does drive a lot of it, and so that's not a ridiculous temptation, and it is definitely present if you don't have people who are around you who can spot it and be like, that's getting weird,
and the willingness to listen.
Yes,
because that's another element that we see in Paul is like, the people around him start to say, this isn't you. Like, I know what you're about to do. Yeah. I know what you're thinking, and that's not it. Yeah. Don't do that. Yeah. And he ultimately goes against that and loses the people around him. Right. For that reason.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's the gospel remedy in the movie? It's one of my favorite things to ask. What's the gospel remedy?
As with everything, fixing our eyes on a true and better Messiah. And I, again, reminding ourselves that Jesus is someone who, even though he was of the same substance as God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. He laid his life down, right? That's the pattern of the Messiah. Yeah. That's the pattern that we should be looking for in leaders. Yeah, for sure. It's the pattern. And I think that you can extrapolate, like, we've made jokes before about pastors with leadership podcasts. Yeah. Yes. And that pastors don't necessarily like have to just be leaders and whatever. And I don't think everyone has to be a leader. That's my kind of hot take, is that not everyone has to be a leader. Some you can follow, and that's okay. That's right. But I think if we're going to looking at leaders in scripture, not just Jesus, obviously Jesus, but like, Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's right. But what is Paul's leadership? What does Paul do in these situations where he is very willing to not be passive, but to be deferential, to listen to other people, absolutely, to not get defensive. When he's called upon by James or something in Acts, where they bring him back to Jerusalem and they're like, "Hey, dude, you were like killing us like 6 months ago. What gives?" And he doesn't get defensive, right? Like he doesn't just start, well, up yours. Like he sits down and he says, "Okay, let me explain it." Yeah, and that's that. I think he's obviously very clearly, again, following after the pattern of Jesus, but it's like, that's leadership. Yeah. Yeah. Right. This willingness to fix our eyes on something true and better. Yeah. And to lay our lives down and be willing to lay our lives down. That's right. Yeah. For the things that matter. Yeah. Absolutely. You're the actual pastor here. What do you feel like?
Oh man. Yeah, that's good. No, absolutely. That pattern, I talk a lot about this with, in a variety of different settings, but biblical dynamics of power are always inverted. Notice in the creation account, who is head of creation. It's Adam. What's his command? Work and keep, or serve and guard. It's the same thing, right? Like, exercise dominion, absolutely, but like that language of serving and keeping, or working as a servant and guarding, protecting, going hand in hand, is the model of leadership throughout. And so really what does a biblical power structure always looks like? Being the first servant. That's what it looks like. Jesus, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, what does he do? He humbles himself. The total, opposite of what Paul talks about at the beginning of Philippians 2 of having, conceitedness and selfish ambition, being literally in the Greek filled up with hot air. What does Christ do instead? He empties himself, not of divinity, but a posture of humbleness and humility, instead taking the form of a servant, and being the suffering servant of Yahweh from Isaiah. So that looks vastly different than the world. Yeah. Kind of.
Well, I love that you brought out that kind of dominion language.
Yeah.
Because I think that's so often abused.
Absolutely.
And overlooked, because what does it mean to have dominion?
Right.
Right. What does it mean when Adam has dominion?
Yeah.
Like, exactly what you said.
Yeah.
To work and serve.
That's right.
He's literally like giving himself over to this land in order to have dominion. Right. And what does Jesus do? Who has dominion over everything, which is what Paul says. Like, Paul's like, he has dominion over all of it.
Yeah.
What does he do? He comes down, he rids himself of glory. Yeah. And he dies.
That's right. And in one sense, he works and he serves. That same command from Adam in the garden to work and to keep is the same command for the priests in the tabernacle and the temple, and Jesus and us as the royal priesthood. And so, the command is the same. The only thing that's changed is our ability to do it without sin. But especially for Christians in the priesthood of all believers, which we believe in here, your call is to work and serve, and to do it with a servant heart.
And I'll add one more thing, that being in Christ, that gives us the freedom.
Absolutely. That's right.
To have that mindset.
Yeah.
That we aren't actually in control. Right. Ultimately.
Right.
And I think it gives us a right view of power. Totally. And if we have that right view of power, where we are able to say, it's not about me. Yeah. Ultimately. Yeah. It is ultimately not centered on me, because it's ultimately not my burden to carry, and it's not my thing to control. Yeah. Yeah. And if we have that view of power, then we are able to serve well.
That's right. It really is from that, which is why I think Paul drives that home both in Romans 11 and in Colossians 1. What he is getting, what he's telling you to do is, in some capacity, hey, stop fighting, because you didn't create all things visible and invisible. And you don't uphold them by the power of your word, and not all things are to you and for you and through you. They're through Jesus. So now, because we know who has ultimate power, and he's a servant, go and be a servant, right? You don't have to fight for power. All the power's already been had. You're just serving the king at this point. So go serve the king. And that changes a lot of posture of how we relate to the world, how we particularly love our neighbor.
Yeah.
So
that's great. Thank you.
Absolutely.
It was a wonderful conversation.
Absolutely.
We will be back next week, where we will have a special guest. And we will be discussing the 2023 film Barbie. We hope that you'll join us then.